Welcome to the Tepper School of Business Multimedia Series. For more information on the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon, please visit us at www.tepper.cmu.edu/multimedia. And now, here's your selected video.
Thank you. For those of you who I've met, my name's Carolyn Hess-Abraham. I'm from the advancement team, and welcome all of the alumni and friends we have back. We're thrilled to have you back at school. It's my pleasure today to go ahead, please sit down. It's my pleasure today to introduce our assistant professor of marketing, Jeff Galak, and I'd like to say, I don't know how many of you were in Dean Damon's remarks this morning at 11:30. A lot of you in the room. Well, one of the really interesting things he said, which is so apt, is he said, you know, all the new and really interesting ideas come out of the young faculty. So, not a lot of pressure, Jeff, but we have one of our really young superstars here with us today. He's got a PhD in marketing from NYU Stern School, and he does very interesting work. He's won several awards already for his research. One of his most recent papers was Microfinance Decision Making, field study of pro-social lending, which is very different perhaps than what he's going to talk about today, but all of our young faculty have amazingly diverse research interests, and they collaborate across the board, so it's a very exciting place to be. It's a very exciting place, I think, to be on the faculty, certainly to be on the staff. And so today, he is going to talk about consumption and satiation. Is that how I say it? And talk about how we can stay happy with what we have. So I'm thrilled to introduce Jeff Galak.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and welcome back for all the alumni in the room. It's great to, I would say, see you all again, but I don't think I've ever seen any of you since I'm a fairly new faculty member. But welcome back nonetheless. So today's talk is going to be about happiness. And I think happiness is one of these topics that's really under-researched, especially in business schools. But if you're a marketer, I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining to you why it matters for consumers and people at large to be happy, right? If you're trying to sell a product, you want to understand what is it that drives them to enjoy that product, get satisfaction from it, and ultimately be happy. I'm not going to spend today's 30 minutes or 45 minutes explaining to you how to sell to people. What instead I'm going to do is talk to you about happiness and well-being in general. And some of my own research. So one thing I should preface to say that my research background comes from behavioral psychology, which is very different from what a lot of people here at Tepper do and what a lot of you have been exposed to when you were getting your degrees here. And so I do want to say that if you have any clarification questions, I'm going to try and make this as clear as possible for you. But if you don't understand some of the methodology that I'm going to be using, please stop me, because if you don't understand, odds are there's other people in the room that don't understand too. So that's my kind of caveat here. Now, with happiness, there's a lot of interesting work. So we know, for example, that there are a few big interventions in life that change your overall level of happiness. So most people's happiness kind of stays relatively flat across their lifetime, with the exception of a few key things we know. For instance, getting married and being happy with your marriage. That's an important one. No, it is. But that has a fundamental net shift in your overall happiness. It really does. Having a child, and only one child, actually increases happiness. The second child doesn't take away, but also doesn't add to your net happiness. This is what the science says. Other important ones are having satisfaction with your job and with your work environment. We know that being in an unsatisfactory job can have detrimental effects to your overall well-being and your happiness in your life. Now, those are true, and there's some wonderful research looking at those things. But I actually don't study that. What I study are smaller interventions, simple things that people can do to potentially change their overall well-being. Because it's one thing for me to tell you that getting married will lead you to be happy. It's a whole other thing for me to say, hey, you, go get married because it's going to make you happy. Right? That's difficult, right? That's a very difficult intervention. And so what I'll show you today are a couple of simple things that actually do lead to happiness and do lead to changes in these things. But before we do that, I'm going to start with a bit of a somber note and talk about a phenomenon that's been around for a long time, since the early 70s, which is known as the hedonic treadmill. And hedonic just refers to things that give you pleasure, give you emotional utility, you can call it. And the hedonic treadmill goes as follows. It says that we're seldom happy with the things that we have. And the reason for that is twofold. So first is something called social comparison. So this is the keeping up with the Joneses effect. You buy a new car. That new car truly makes you happy in the moment that you buy it. Right? There's absolute positive utility for that. But unfortunately, your neighbor buys a slightly shinier new car. Right? And in comparison, your car is not quite so nice anymore, and the utility you get from it is not as great. And what does that force you to do? It forces you to go out and buy an even shinier new car. Your neighbor then does the same thing, and it's a never-ending cycle. And so we're constantly forced to kind of upgrade, to kind of get that next best thing, to maintain the same level of utility that we got from an experience absent any of such social comparison. So that's a big cause of this hedonic treadmill. That's actually not what I'm going to focus on today. What I'm going to focus on is the second cause, which is satiation, which is what Carolyn suggested. This is a lot of what I study, satiation or boredom, or just being tired. So absent any social comparison, your shiny new car on day 1 brings you a lot more pleasure than it does on day 100, and certainly more than it does on day 1000. It's just by the nature of the experience, we as humans satiate. Some of you might think of it as boredom, might think diminishing marginal utility over time. Same basic idea. Right? With time, absent any external stimuli, you're just going to become less happy with the experiences that you have. And if that's the case, that's a problem, because what's going to happen again? The utility you get from that experience, the hedonic pleasure that you get from it decreases over time. You're forced to buy something new, something bigger, something shinier to replace it, to start that cycle over and over and over again. Okay, and this is that hedonic treadmill where you're constantly stuck on it. And so my question is, how do you step off that treadmill? Right? How do you actually prevent this satiation or this boredom from occurring in the first place? And if you can do that, and if you can do that with simple interventions, what I'm going to argue is that you can actually significantly affect overall life satisfaction. Right? That's the basic thesis that I'm going to present here, and I'll show you a couple of different ways in which this happens. Before I do that, I just want to get everybody on the same page so that we understand what I mean when I say satiation. And again, if you prefer the term boredom or diminishing marginal utility or adaptation or habituation or any other term that basically describes this decreasing slope of enjoyment with time, feel free to sub that out for satiation. I'll stick with that from now on. What it looks like, and this is stylized, right? This isn't data. This is just a demonstration. If you've got time on the x-axis and you've got enjoyment or utility, pleasure, whatever you want to call it, on the y-axis, you have an experience that starts off enjoyable. With time, with exposure, that enjoyment decreases through some functional form. It's not necessarily concave. It could be whatever you want. But an important property of that is that if you remove yourself from the stimulus, if you take the stimulus away, after some period of time, there's something that's known as spontaneous recovery. And to some degree, there's an increase in enjoyment. How much that is, how long this takes, that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay, and then again, the cycle continues over and over again, right? This is that pattern. And there's quite a bit of research that's looked at, some of my own and some of others, how to change the experiences kind of here. When you're consuming, when you're having that experience, how do you slow this rate down? And when you're just not doing anything, how do you slow that down? So for example, one of my favorite all-time research paradigms, unfortunately it's not my own, it's by a professor named Brian Wansink, who's at Cornell. Some of you might have read his book called Mindless Eating. It's a wonderful book about consumption and kind of the inputs to satiation and our food consumption in general. And he looks at the moments when you're consuming, and specifically he looks at food consumption, but this generalizes to just about anything that brings you pleasure. It could be a song, a piece of art, a car, a social interaction. It can be anything. He primarily focuses on food. And what he says is that the absolute quantity of consumption isn't actually relevant. What's relevant is your perception of that consumption quantity. And so in a brilliant experiment, what Brian did, and this is Brian in his evil soup laboratory, as I can only imagine, he had participants in an experiment eat soup. Okay, and there were two groups of participants. They were randomly assigned. There was you guys and there was you guys. And you were given soup and you were simply told just eat. Everybody's given soup and told just eat until you're full. And when you're full, just feel free to stop. And you're given a normal bowl, and you're given another bowl, which is what you can kind of see here. He devised this contraption where there's a bowl, and there's a tube that goes through some sort of piping underneath to this vat of soup over here. And if you remember your basic physics, as you start consuming the soup, it automatically refills itself, unbeknownst to the participants. And so they test this, they make sure nobody knows what's going on. And so the question is, how much soup do you eat? You, who have just a regular bowl, nothing fancy going on, eat some amount of soup. You eat about 60% more soup before you say you're full. And the reason is it's perceptual cues, right? So you don't see that the soup volume is going down as quickly, and so that doesn't actually feed into your understanding of how full, how satiated you are. Because that's really interesting research. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the types of things that are already out there. In the space between consumptions, so between experiences, there's some work that looks at what do you do, what's the input to satiation? So what causes people to get tired? How do we slow it down, and so on? One bit of work, which is my own, looks at what happens when you introduce disruptions. Just basically, if you have a continuous experience and you just take breaks from it. And so one example that I like to use is massages, actually. So you imagine a massage, everybody says, oh, it's going to be a wonderful experience throughout the whole time. It turns out, no, that tends to wane with time. But if you just step away from it, you actually can, and then come back, you can actually have a better experience. So to give you a concrete example of this, in one research paradigm, so we have a whole paper on this, we actually look at TV commercials and television. And what we do is we take TV and we edit out the commercials, or we show it as is, and we ask a very simple question. How much did you just enjoy the last 30 minutes of your life, or 23 minutes of your life, whatever it winds up being? And in many cases, not all cases, commercials actually wind up making the experience more enjoyable. This is completely controlling for, I know it sounds funny, this is controlling for things like the quality of the commercial. So if I take out bad commercials, or if I take out good commercials, you can imagine like a Super Bowl type situation. Well, sure, the commercials make it good because I'm watching the commercials and not the Super Bowl. That's not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about regular, everyday television in many, many contexts, and I won't get into the specifics, actually introducing breaks, just disruptions work. And there's nothing special about commercials. You can go to the bathroom and it would do the exact same thing. Right? It's just taking a disruption from an experience. That's an effect that it has. It's slow satiation. Right? And we can show that, and we do through a series of experiments. Other things that you could do, for instance, during this time period is introduce variety into your consumption experience. So you could imagine eating a bunch of M&Ms, one right after the other. That gets tiring after a while. You introduce Skittles in the mix, and things get better. Right? So this is, but that's reality, right? And so you're going to be happier with that experience than you would be if you just had the single stimulus repeatedly, right? So this is straightforward. These interventions do work. What I want to focus on now is actually the next step, which is that moment when you're about to decide, what am I going to have right now? Right? Everything that has happened in your life has already happened. And now the question is, can I do something? Can I do something, in particular something very simple, that's going to change your interpretation of your past experiences? And so what do I mean by this? In what I showed you previously, the way to actually affect satiation and slow things down is to change your experience. So this is like telling you to get married. Okay? It's not quite as extreme to say eat some Skittles as it is to say get married, but it's the same idea, right? What I'm actually going to have to ask you to do is change the way you live your life. I say have more variety, take more breaks, right? Change. So Brian does this beautiful work on plate size, and he shows that plate size changes your perception of how much you've consumed. So I'm going to say go change all your flatware in your homes. Now, that will all work, but that's all very difficult to implement, right? Because most people don't want to change their day-to-day routines. They just kind of want to live their lives the way they do. And so what I want to say is, okay, given that life has happened, given that up to here, basically, life has happened, how can we still affect satiation? And in order to do that, we actually have to change the way that we think about satiation and boredom fundamentally. And so this is, my work has basically taken this question and tried to reshape the last 50 years or so of research on satiation and boredom. Now, most research up to the point of mostly my work and some others as well has said that satiation is like a meter. And it just tracks. And there's some sort of formula in your head, however that works, that says, you know, you've had X units of the stimulus, you've had Y time since the last time you've had that stimulus, you've had Z other experiences, therefore you are A, satiated and want to continue eating to some degree, right? That's been the model that's been around forever, okay? As long as this has been studied, this is what people have believed happens. And it makes sense, right? That's not wrong. It's still correct, right? The more M&Ms I eat, just purely volume of M&Ms I eat, the less likely I'm going to want to eat more M&Ms. I will be satiated, I'll be full, I won't get the same utility out of those. Like, that's just true. But it's not the whole story. And what I'm going to say is that the rest of the story is what I call this constructed account of satiation. So there's a lot of research going on in the domain of preferences. So how much do you like something in general, which shows that actually we're not so good at knowing what we like. That what we like is very much dependent on the situation and by external cues that we're faced with. Much of that work was actually pioneered here at CMU, some in this building and some across the street at Social and Decision Sciences, looking at contextual cues that affect preferences. And so what I think, and I'll show you, is that satiation works just like this. That it doesn't actually matter how much of something you've consumed, within reason, and it doesn't actually matter when you consumed it, and it doesn't actually matter what else you consumed. What matters is that at the moment that you're about to consume some stimulus again, whether it is hanging out with a friend, whether it's eating a food, looking at a beautiful work of art, whatever it is, what matters is your interpretation of all that past life. So if we just kind of back up for 1 second, here, life has happened. And all this other work has looked, and my own as well, has looked at how do we change the experiences we have in life. What I want to do is change how you interpret those experiences, how you construe what does it mean to eat 10 M&Ms? Well, if there's a meter, it's just 10 M&Ms. Whatever that formula spits out, it tells you that 10 M&Ms means you're going to enjoy the 11th one this much, and you're going to eat it this much. I'm saying no. We have no way of knowing what 10 M&Ms means. Instead, the context is going to determine that for us. And so what I'll do is I'll show you 3 paradigms. These are 3 separate papers, basically. And I'm going to pull out just one experiment from each paper just to give you a flavor of what it is that I do that look at this question. So the first one, I'm going to look at a phenomenon that we term variety amnesia, which looks at your perception of what other experiences, what variety you've had. And I'll get into the detail in just a moment. In the second one, we'll look at the perception of quantity. So again, this is 10 M&Ms. What does 10 M&Ms mean? Right? What does that actually mean for our own experience and our own subsequent enjoyment that we get from that? And the last one I'll look at is the time. So how much time has passed, but not reality of time, but the subjective interpretation of time. And I'll get into the detail and it'll become clearer as we go. But again, if something is unclear, please do stop me. So we'll just jump right into the first one. So it turns out that, as I said a moment ago, introducing variety into your life actually does reduce satiation and maintains this enjoyment that you have with experiences. So again, 10 M&Ms in a row, you'll get bored. You'll stop enjoying those M&Ms. Intersperse those with Skittles or something, and that gets better. But it turns out that our memories are just not that good. And when you're about to eat another M&M and make a decision, do I want another M&M? You don't spontaneously think about the fact that you had Skittles and Hershey Kisses and what other foods you might have consumed that you kind of put in the same category. You just don't do that. And so despite the fact that you actually had all this variety that should, based on all the theories that we know of up to this point, you should, in fact, continue to want to eat M&Ms, you don't. And so what we can do is show that that's the case, but better yet, we can turn that off. What we can do is with a very simple manipulation, with a very simple intervention, we can actually have you recall the other experiences, the other variety that you've had. So if you imagine I'm about to consume a meal, and I can either think of one of 2 things. I can think about other experiences that I've had with that meal, or I can think about all the other foods that I've had. All those other foods, they happened regardless of whether I thought about them or not. You consumed them, right? You had that meal. But what we're going to argue, this is why we call it variety amnesia, is you don't. You forget, you neglect to think about the fact that you've had other experiences, and you instead hyper-focus on the actual focal stimuli. And so let me make that very concrete for you by demonstrating one experiment that we ran. So this is one in a number of experiments. And just for my own kind of sense, how many of you are familiar with behavioral experiments in the sense that you've either discussed them in a class or read about them or anything like that? Just a show of hands? Okay, great. So just about everybody. But again, please stop me if there's something that becomes unclear. So again, one of several experiments that we ran. In this experiment, it was done in 2 parts over a course of 3 weeks. And these are going to be students that come to a lab to take part in an experiment. So if you've ever taken Psych 101 when you were an undergrad, you know you took part in these experiments. This is basically the flavor of what happened here. And we're going to look at the stimuli of music. And so participants are going to look at, they're going to choose a song from the top 20 songs of that current week's Billboard chart. So we know it's going to be an enjoyable song. I'll show you that in a moment. And we're going to ask them just to listen to it and tell us how much they enjoy it. But we're going to put a little tweak in there, and we're going to have them actually do that 20 times in a row. And so what we try to accomplish in experiments is we're trying to simulate reality. Right? What we're trying to do is get as close as we can to what happens in the real world, but in a controlled manner. Right? Because if I just survey people on the street, there's a million things that could be going on that I don't have any control over. In the laboratory, I have complete control over everything that's happening. And so while this might not be the most perfect proxy for reality, it's as close as I'm going to be able to get with something like this. And so you'll see what happens in a second. And so we're going to ask them how much they enjoy their experience every single time. And what we're trying to do here is simulate that boredom that happens. Right? We're trying to simulate the fact that, you know what, it turns out if you listen to music enough, you get bored of it. You satiate to it. Right? And so this is our way of simulating it. So that's going to happen, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. 3 weeks later, the exact same people are going to come back to the laboratory, and now we're going to randomly assign them to one of 2 groups. So just like that experiment I talked to with Brian, we have 2 groups. They're going to be randomly chosen. You're going to be in this group, you're going to be in this group, and we're going to perform our intervention here. And if, as I proposed to you, people don't spontaneously think about the variety of experiences they've had, and the experiences in this case are whatever the heck they did in those 3 weeks, right? People listen to music. These are college undergrads. They certainly listen to music in the 3-week period between the 2 experiments. Now the question is, do they think about that when they're asked to again listen to wrong click, are again asked to listen to that song. So they're going to be told, you're going to listen to the song, but before you do that, we'd like to ask you over here to first think about all the music that you listened to in the last 3 weeks. And you here as a control, right, we're just going to say think about all the other TV shows, just some other random things so they have some task to do. And the hypothesis is hopefully straightforward at this point. When you're asked to recall the fact that you've had music in your experience, you won't be quite as bored with this initial song, because just kind of think about it for yourself. If you think that all you do is listen to one song over and over again, and that's the only thing you've experienced, of course you're going to be bored with that. And what we're doing is we're saying, no, that's not the case. In fact, what happens is your life is much more varied than you thought it was without this intervention. And we're going to then have them listen to that song again and tell us how much they enjoy it, and we're going to see what happens to that enjoyment relative to the initial decrease. So first of all, let me just show you that, in fact, we did, in fact, induce satiation the way that we suggested. So it was a 101-point scale, where 100 means I love the song and 0 means I hate the song, and they're telling us each time how much they enjoy it. This is that first part in the first part of the experiment. They initially enjoyed it about an 80 out of 100, so this is good. We wanted them to start with a song that they really liked. This was done by design. And then with time, that decreased, unsurprisingly, right? I mean, think about listening to your favorite song 20 times in a row. Right? This isn't surprising. This is more of like, did we simulate what we thought we were going to simulate? Yes, right, check. One thing that most behavioral researchers do is at the end of their experiments, they ask participants for comments. This is stupid things. This is like, did we have any typos? Just let us know. Was there some buggy thing in the program? And usually we ignore these because there's nothing substantive in there. This time, well, they're really isn't. They're just meant to be like, do you have any comments, right? It's an open-ended, just tell us if we screwed something up. This time they were interesting. So at the end of this experience, they didn't know that there was going to be something 3 weeks later, and so they were simply asked, what comments do you have about it? I never share these, but it's just totally worth doing. And so these are comments. This is, I don't think I'll listen to Love Stoned again for a long time. This dates the experiment, by the way. The experiment has made me dislike Stronger. I don't think I want to listen to it anymore. I hate this song now. Which is not to be confused with I hate that song now. And then my personal favorite, which is thanks for making me hate my favorite song. These have absolutely no scientific value, but they're just totally entertaining. The really interesting question, though, is now what happens to their enjoyment of that song 3 weeks later after we make them think about either the other music that they on their own listen to over the course of those 3 weeks or not. In this case, the not is just thinking about the TV shows, just something else for them to do. And so here, and sorry, it's not super clear, but the red line is their initial enjoyment the first time they listen to that song. So this is absent anything we've ever done. If I just said, hey, listen to the song, how much did you like it? They would say 80. Okay? And if we don't do anything, and this is a control, is to think about the TV shows, they still kind of hate the song at the end, 3 weeks later. Okay? So this is a 45, so relative to about 80. Okay, this is 3 weeks later, they listen to the song once, and they tell us how much did you enjoy that piece of music. If we instead say, think about the other music that you listened to over the course of the 3 weeks, we get a lot higher enjoyment. And this is a trivial intervention, right? They spend 15 seconds thinking about this stuff. And all of a sudden, their actual enjoyment changes. Now, I'm not going to show you all the other stuff where we ask them to do things like buy the music, choose between listening to this song again versus something else, where it's much more consequential than just saying, oh, yeah, I like the song or I don't. So we have very consequential outputs to this that, if you're a marketer, are very, very clear what you could do with these types of things. But if you're just a human being and you want to maintain happiness, the interventions here is pretty straightforward as well. Just think about the variety you have in your life. When you sit down to eat your same sandwich that you eat for lunch every single day because your cafeteria is not very varied, just think about the fact that you also eat dinner and breakfast and have snacks and have lots of other foods. And I'm not even joking when I say that that should, in fact, make you enjoy that sandwich more. And we have many other experiments that document this as well. I just wanted to give you a flavor of one. Yeah?
Quick question.
Please.
Does the human mind get used to variety as well? So, for example, if I had 10 M&Ms and then one Snicker, and I did that for a year, I'd get used to the fact that I had that one variety, so now I have to change it up even more, and even more, and even more.
The short answer is yes, you would get used to it. The longer answer, slightly longer answer, is that it turns out how you think about those experiences. So if what you're doing is eating candy, then it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's a Hershey Kiss or a Skittle or an M&M. If you're thinking about M&Ms and Skittles and Hershey Kisses, those are 3 distinct experiences, and those will introduce variety into your life. It's not necessarily related to this,
right,
but it turns out the way you construe the experience in the sense of the category that you're consuming will affect things. So the narrower the category, so it's a red Skittle, it's a blue Skittle, it's a green Skittle, those experiments have been run, and that does work. So in fact, this was done with M&Ms, not Skittles, because they actually are the same. Even M&Ms, which taste the same, just have different colors, it works, right? The idea is that now those are unique experiences. There's variety in there. As opposed to if I just say you're eating candy, then all those blend into one and you get satiated much faster. It's a slightly different point from here, but yeah, that's a nice question. Okay. Yeah, sure.
So when you talk about variety, wouldn't thinking about other TV shows increase the variety? So why is it that other music is...
In this case, had we said something like, this is about entertainment, then yes, because the same idea there as the category, but we were very specific that it's about a musical experience. So again, in an experiment, what we're trying to do is get as specific to really understand the phenomenon in a controlled manner. In the real world, if you thought about music and TV as the same thing, as they weren't different experiences, but they were in fact part of the same entertainment category for you, yeah, thinking about TV would work as well. But we've done this where we don't ask them to do anything, where we have completely different manipulations to get the same idea. Again, just one example for you. Okay. Oh yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sure. No, that's fine.
So I go to work. If I'm kind of bored of my job, say, that happens.
Sounds hard.
So if I all of a sudden start thinking about all the other activities I do, I'll all of a sudden be happier.
It depends on how you construe those activities. If you have in your mind a work bucket and an other bucket, then it won't, because that other has no impact on your work. But if you can imagine that you have many different tasks at your job, and you're really bored of doing data entry, because who's not bored of doing data entry, right? Thinking about the fact that you've got all these other experiences should, in fact, change the enjoyment you get from that. It's also predicated on that you get enjoyment, right? If you don't like it, I can't make you like the experience. I can if you initially like the experience, I can help you avoid this satiation, right? If that makes sense. Okay, let me move on, because I think we're supposed to go till 2:45. We'll just take questions in the mix. So this is one way to do this. Okay, another way to do this is to change your subjective interpretation of how much you've had. So I alluded to this already in the introduction. So instead of thinking about how many, I guess in this case, grapes you've had, because that should be the case, right? Physiologically, you ate, 267, I guess, grams of grapes. You should be 267 grams of grapes satiated, right? That's the model. And we say no, because that's not how our minds work. Our minds are much more constructive, right? And we're much more likely to completely change our interpretation of how much we've had of experience as a function of some external cues. So again, let me show you just one example out of many. And in this case, we're going to shift focus to art or photographs, if you are okay with photographs being part of art. And we're going to ask participants to look at some art. Again, we're going to get them to satiate. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to have them do this a lot, and I'm going to make them bored of this, right? That's just a simulation for us. And then I'm going to find a way to change their interpretation of how many times they've been exposed to this experience. So they're going to look at this photograph. They're going to do it for 15 seconds at a time, and they're going to do it 20 times in a row. And again, they're going to tell us how much they enjoyed each time. And again, all we're trying to do here is simulate the real world, right? It's just impossible for us to know when you come into the lab how many times you've seen a particular photo or a song or a food. We can approximate those types of things, but this is a little bit cleaner. Some time is going to pass. And importantly, one thing I forgot is that we're not going to tell them how many times they're seeing this. There's absolutely no cue to say that this is the first photo, the second photo, the 20th photo. That's very, very important, right? Because otherwise, if they knew the objective number, it would be much more difficult. What we're going to do is we're going to change the sense of how much they've actually experienced this. And the way we're going to do this is by asking them a question. And we're going to ask them how many times they saw this photo. So this is about 5 minutes later. And again, we're going to randomly assign them into two groups. So you guys, we're going to ask on the following scale. We're going to say, how many times did you see this photo? 1 to 3 times, 5 to 6 times, more than 15 times. You guys, we're going to ask on this scale. 1 to 30 times, 31 to 60 times, more than 50 times. And so the idea is the following, that people on the left are going to be more likely to respond towards the bottom of the scale, and people on the right are going to be more likely to respond to the top of the scale. Okay, that's intuitive enough. What's a little bit more interesting is that it turns out we interpret what our responses mean to scales. So by responding towards the bottom, it suggests that you had a lot, because the comparison is that, well, there's a lot less over here. Whereas if you respond towards the top here, you say, well, I guess I didn't have that many, because there's a possibility to have 150. Okay? And so I can't remember if I hid the slide or not, but we actually do then ask them subjectively, how many photos did you see? 1 to 7, a few, a lot. And you get this exactly what you'd predict, right? That this manipulation does what it suggests to you that it does. So first of all, again, did we induce satiation? Yes, we did. I don't have any witty comments, unfortunately, in this one. But So it started out, they enjoyed the photo, that's great, that's what we wanted, right? Again, I can't start with something they hated because it just doesn't work. They enjoyed this thing initially, that was done intentionally, eventually they don't enjoy it quite as much. Did they respond the way we thought they would respond? Not exactly. I mean, we thought that everybody would be kind of towards the bottom because they saw it 20 times, but this actually at least suggests to you that they're not counting, right? They're just sitting in that experience. But that's important to us, right? Because if they were counting objectively that they had 10, we could still do this, but it would be harder for us to get the same effect. So most people respond towards the bottom. Almost everybody responds towards the top, except for a crazy person over here. I don't know. I'll tell you that you could do the analysis on this data with or without this person, and nothing changes. And so what happens, right? So again, can we affect how much they enjoy this photo? So after all this is done, we're going to have them look at the photo again and tell us how much do you enjoy this photo. And then again, we'll do consequential things like how much do you want to pay for a poster of this? If you're exposed to two options between looking at this photo or looking at a different photo, which one do you choose? That's consequential, right? Because you're about to have an experience, you have a choice, right? But I'm just going to show you the enjoyment measures. So again, the red line, which is again, sorry, a little faded, is their initial enjoyment that very first time they ever saw that photo. In the control condition, where we don't ask them to do anything that I just described to you, they don't do that scale. This is just our measure of like what happens baseline. They enjoy it less. Not surprising, right? Less than they initially enjoyed it. That's just consistent. When we make them feel like they had a lot, which is where they respond towards the bottom of that scale, this isn't going to make you happier. This is going to make you less happy. And in fact, it does, right? You enjoy the experience less. But when we make you think about the fact that you had few of these experiences, you actually do increase your enjoyment. And so again, if what your goal is to maintain enjoyment with the experiences you have and not be forced to buy yet another photograph and yet another piece of art or whatever it might be to kind of maintain that same level of happiness, changing your interpretation of how much of that experience you've had can have a significant effect. And we've done this for things, again, like food. We've done this for art. We've done it for music. We've done it for social interactions. We've done it for all sorts of different experiences. And I can show you that I can completely change how enjoyable the subsequent experience will be just by changing your interpretation of how much you've had. Now remember, I'm not changing how much you actually had, because that's not what I'm trying to do here. Life is just going to happen, right? And it's very hard for me to change that for you. Instead, what I'm going to do is try and change your interpretation of what happened in your lifetime. Any questions on this one? Because then I'll go to the last one. The last one's my favorite, actually. Okay. So the last one is we're going to look at time. So again, in reality, if I didn't have a cheeseburger for 5 years, I'm going to like it more than if I had a cheeseburger 5 minutes ago. Right? Clearly, that's going to be the case. And that's true of art. That's true of everything. Again, our minds don't work that way. Right? It turns out time is not an objective input into our interpretation of our experiences. Instead, we have to be cued to know what time means. Now, I am going to pull a little bit of a twist here, which is that the reason we did this research is because we thought, hey, it's the same type of concept. Satiation is constructed, and we want to show it as many different possible ways as we can to kind of converge on truth. And so we looked at time, and most of my research really does focus on this idea of making people happier. For whatever reason, well, not for whatever, there are good reasons, we actually can't make it feel like an experience happened farther back in time, which would be what you would need to make people happier, right? Because then you're less satiated. If it happened objectively a day ago, but it feels like it happened a year ago, well, you're not going to be satiated, right? You're going to continue enjoying that. We can't do that. And there's like psychophysical reasons in the way we interpret time that actually explain why this happens. And so, too bad for us. What does work is the opposite, is we can make it feel like an experience happened more recently than it actually did. And so, in the story of trying to make you happier, that's just not going to do it. That's going to make you less happy. But in the story of trying to curb something like obesity, that can be very powerful. So as I'm sure all of you know, obesity is a tremendous epidemic in this country and worldwide right now. And there are lots and lots of attempts to get people to reduce their consumption levels through either very intrusive manipulations or less so, which is what I'll show you here. And so if I can actually make it feel like your last meal happened more recently than it actually did, I should be able to get you to eat less. And so again, we've run a number of experiments. One that I'm going to show you we ran in the field, and we actually ran it at Panera Bread's, the one right by Giant Eagle, Market District. And so here's what we did. And you know what? I left my prop, unfortunately. So what we did is we had people, as they were about to enter, so customers, as they were about to enter Panera Bread, this is for dinner, we stopped them on the street right before they were about to go in the store, and we said, excuse me, would you mind participating in an experiment? We'll pay you $1 at the end of everything if you don't mind. And what we did is we presented them with a scale. And so the scale is, I wish I brought it, and I'm sorry I didn't. It's a physical scale where you can take this little knob and you can move it from side to side. And the knob is always going to start right here. And we simply say, excuse me, would you mind just answering this question? And they take it and they move it wherever they move it. And again, we're going to have multiple groups. We'll have a control group where they don't do any of this stuff because we just want to see how much people eat normally. We'll have another group where they're going to have the scale and it's going to have the surrounding area which says on the right side now, when you last ate, and hopefully it wasn't now, and a day ago. Okay, and so they'll move it to reflect whatever their answer is. And in the other version, it's going to say now, and it's going to say a month ago. And I know that intuitively that just seems completely silly, but all we're trying to accomplish is change how far they're moving this thing. Because it turns out, and we validated this in the lab, other people have done the same, is that this acts as a form of mental time travel, basically. And so the farther you move this thing, the farther back in time it feels like that event occurred. And so despite the fact that a month ago it feels like it should be like farther back in time, no, you're only going to do this and you're going to go, a month ago, like I had food 2 hours ago, right? Of course. You're just going to tick the little thing over just a little bit, right? That's all that's going to happen. And so the idea is, if we do this, it should change when it feels like you last ate, which should then make you feel more satiated in this case. And if you're more satiated, you should eat less. And so what we do is we do this. We then ask them, and I'm just not going to show it for time, when they last ate subjectively. So I ate a while ago, I ate recently, just on a 9-point scale. I'll show you that exactly what happens is what I'm suggesting to you happens. You just have to believe me. And then we're going to get the register receipts, and we're going to see what they bought. So I don't know what they physically put in their mouths, right, because I don't get to observe that. But I get the register receipt, and man, that is pretty close estimation of like how much they're actually going to eat. So I don't know what they ate, but the correlation between what they purchased and what they ate is like 0.95. Okay, so that'll be as close as I can get. So first of all, how far did they move this thing? This is just, did we do what we thought we did? Yeah, they move it farther when it's a day ago than when it's a month ago, right? No surprise here. How much did they eat? How much did they purchase? So in the control, this is when we don't do anything. We just ask them to give us their register receipts. These people had no intervention of any kind. They eat about 770 calories, When we asked them the long ago, so this is where we actually tried to make it feel as if it were farther back in time to get them to eat more, because the idea here was to can we make them happier and less satiated? We couldn't do that, so there's really no effect here. The number's bigger, but it's not statistically significantly bigger. But when we make it feel like that last meal was really close in time, we get a pretty substantial reduction. So it's about 12% reduction in consumption. And it turns out that's all you need, right? So if we could get this effect all the time for everybody at every meal, 12% would wipe out obesity in this country, right? I don't mean to claim that this is the one golden answer to obesity, right? It's clearly not. But if you get any effects, any movements to reduction in consumption in a very unobtrusive way, right? I'm not telling these people what to do. I'm simply asking them when they last had their meal. And I'm focusing them on the fact that their last meal might have not been so long ago, right? I'm making it feel that way. They eat less, and that could have some very positive effects for us as a country, as a world, and for the individuals as well. So I'm wrapping up. I have a few minutes left. There are these 3 ways that I've shown you, and we've got others as well, looking at this idea that satiation is not what we once thought, this kind of mechanistic process which just tallies up our experiences and spits out an answer of how much I'm enjoying my life, how satiated I am, how bored I am, whatever it might be. Instead, it's completely, well, not completely, but it's very much constructed based on these cues. And if you could take advantage of these cues, you can significantly increase either people's happiness with their lives and with the experiences they have, or significantly decrease the amount of consumption they have. And in the domain of obesity, that could be a very important input. So with that, I'll just say thank you and stay happy. Questions? Yes.
So luckily, not speaking from personal experience here, but say you have a situation where your categorization of whatever it may be, whether it's your work life, your personal life, is probably just wrong or incorrect. Like maybe you're thinking about your relationship in terms of, oh, I'm stuck with this person for the rest of my life. You know, what are some practical ways? What are some practical ways to go about that recategorization in a healthier way?
Recategorization, I'll be honest, is not actually my area of research. So that turns out to be true. Other people have done this, but I have other interventions that can work just as nicely. So we've done this not with spouses because we explicitly wanted to avoid situations where there's just a chronic experience with that person, right? Like your spouse, you're with them all the time. And it's very difficult to make that feel different than what it is. It just turns out that's a tough one. But we've done it with friends. So maybe this is as close as I can get to your question. So if you haven't seen a friend in a while, I can mess with that basically. I can make it feel as if it's been a long time since you've interacted with that friend or a short period of time. I could do it via the variety manipulation. So we have done that, right? We ask you, what other friends have you interacted with in the last week other than this focal friend who you're kind of tired of seeing? Just making you think about that for a few seconds recovers how much you're enjoying the interaction with that friend. You're more likely to want to interact with that person. You're more likely to pick up the phone and call them, do things like that. With a spouse, it's a little trickier because you're always with your spouse. There are more. Yeah. So there's. The reality of it is, this isn't necessarily the research that I'm doing now, but there's very good research looking at things like absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? The reality is going to a conference for a couple of days, going away with your friends, it does have a very nice effect on recovering you from any satiation or boredom you might have with a spouse or a friend or a close other. I mean, that's true, right? I don't usually study those things because it's just hard for me to recommend that to somebody. I wish I could help your marital problems. That's as close as I'm going to get. Yes, please.
How about satiation in the context of behavioral healing? Did you look at that and thought about it?
Do you have something in particular in mind? Or?
No, this concept of sort of declining happiness and holding periods of investments or how it affects investors.
So no, and to my knowledge, no one's looked at anything like that. If you have specific ideas, I would love to talk to you about them afterwards. I mean, I think it's a good area to study. I just don't know it anymore. Other questions? Yes.
So does your research also translate to, being more proactive? So it sounds like these things are, okay, after it's happened, let me look back. But let's say, for example, New Year's resolutions. People come up with them, and it doesn't necessarily mean that because your New Year's resolution is to lose 10 pounds, you're going to be happy when you lose them. So do you make the New Year's resolution, I'm going to have more variety in my life instead of losing 10 pounds? Or how
if we're in the space of actually changing the way you live your life as opposed to kind of just changing the way you think about it, there's a lot that you can do. Losing weight is probably not that one. People aren't happier when they lose weight, not any significant amount. That's not one of those things, right, when I started saying that's not something that actually matters. It matters for health, it matters for societal costs, things of that sort. But in terms of, dropping a few pounds because of your New Year's resolution has no effect on your happiness, in fact. Being more engaged with your family and with your friends, that's going to be a big one. So if you had to ask me what's the one thing that's most actionable, but really involves changing your life, is spend more time with close others. That's it. Because I can tell you, have a happier job or be more satisfied with your job, that's hard, right? That means switching job. But spending more time with your family, with your friends, and in a meaningful way, that will have a very large net effect on happiness. Yeah. Yes?
Has there been any research done with satiation and depression?
So basically, do depressives get satiated faster? I don't know. That's a great question. I don't think there has been any work done on that. Depressives have a whole other host of of psychological phenomena associated with them. The reality is most of what we do kind of in behavioral psychology at a business school and kind of even in psychology in many psychology departments around the country is what we'll call normal psychology. And this isn't meant to be normal, abnormal, and with a valence on it. Right? I'm not saying one is bad or not, but we kind of study what happens normally. When you introduce depression, that's a clinical diagnosis, and now the psychology and even the physiology of people changes significantly, and I'm not expert enough to be able to address that. Yeah. Yes?
It'd be great to hear your personal story about these principles and whether you apply them in your personal life, and what are some of the things that you were really touchy and now you sort of can manage that better.
I do really hard try to think about variety now. So because to me that's one of the biggest findings that we have is that people really don't do this. So you sit down to a meal and you never think about the fact that you've had other meals like that. So as soon as I notice, it's hard because you don't think about this constantly, right? It's totally anti the norm for people, for myself, right? But I do try as hard as I can. If I'm tired of a meal, if we're going to the restaurant for the 20th time, I do try and say to myself, yeah, but we go to all these other places too. And I hope that has an effect, right? I really do. It's hard because I can't run an experiment on myself, right? I can't simultaneously do that and not do that. I don't know if for myself it's having an effect, but it should. I try to do that. A lot of this started, by the way, when I realized I got tired of eating the same egg bagel every morning.
Do any of these techniques have a diminishing returns for using them?
Yeah, so we've done this repeatedly for as many as something like 5 or 6 interventions. And I don't know the answer after. It seems to work consistently. I don't know that it would work if you just did it one right after the other interventions, but we've done it spacing them out a few days and weeks. 5 or 6 we've done, and it works.
At the same levels.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, there's variation, but pretty much. I don't know if beyond that, right? It might dwindle, but this is, so there's a lot of hands there. So why don't we do 1 and then 2? I feel like I'm neglecting the
Sure. So relating to your answer for that one, where you say you try hard the restaurant or bring a lot of meals you have. So have you studied what happens when you tell people that this affects this? If this affects still, goes on.
Yeah, we have that works.
Diminishes it.
It seems to continue working.
Even if it's fully aware that it's...
Yeah, because it's not like, we're not trying to trick you. We're just trying to change your interpretation of what something means. And so you might be fully aware that you're tricking yourself, but if it still feels like it happened more recently, for instance, it still feels like it happened more recently, right? There doesn't seem to be a detriment. Is there a limit to that? Probably. But when we've done it in the lab, we don't get any real effects.
So do you have a bag of M&Ms for us?
I want to ask, so certainly we capture that there's more variety that adds to happiness, but then you also point out it depends on how we categorize them.
Yes.
So have you done studies on at what point the quantity of categories forces people to think of it as a block? So I think of going into some retail stores now where instead of 5 brands of coffee, you have to pick from 30, and then it's overwhelming. So people tend to then almost retract from too much variety.
Yeah, so not my own work, but there's been work looking at choice overload as a phenomenon. So there's a wonderful book called Paradox of Choice that's on this, looking at what happens exactly in the situation you described. And it's really not related to satiation, but what you do find is when you introduce so much variety, it becomes overwhelming. You basically exit from that situation. Instead of purchasing, you exit. And if you do purchase, what it does is it causes you to have more regret down the road because there's so many more possible alternatives that could have been better than the one you chose.
That's why I have no coffee at home.
In terms of satiation, with the overwhelming amount of variety, there's really just not much of it. But there are effects of that. Yeah, and then Carolyn, you'll tell me when you stop. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple more.
Yeah.
Is there any research on whether young children respond to these things the same way adults do?
There is, and they don't. So young children have much slower satiation. So kids, I mean, I don't have kids, but if you do, you probably know that they can watch the same TV show. I assume that's where you're coming from. So the work on this that I know basically shows that a lot of, well, this isn't even relevant to children, it's actually relevant to everybody. So the more novel an experience is, the more unique features you can get out of it, the less likely you are to satiate. So a beautiful work of art, a complex work of art, will take much more time before you start decreasing your enjoyment than, say, a simple piece of art. Children get a lot more out of each experience than we do. Right? Once you've seen Blue's Clues once, you kind of got it. But your child hasn't really gotten all the parts out of it by the 5th or 6th time, and that's one of the reasons that they don't satiate at the same rate. It's probably not the only reason, because in the developmental phases, psychology is very, very different. Yeah, in the back of it. Oh, sure.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Do you have any thoughts on vacations? How many?
I love vacations.
Specifically, I was thinking how many you should take, how long they should be. Are a lot of short ones better than one big one?
So that, yes. Lots of short vacations tend to be better than one big one, and there's actually very good work on this done. Okay. So a 2-week vacation, it's person specific, but a 2-week vacation is often not as good in resetting as would be, let's say, a bunch of shorter weekend trips.
Okay.
Right? That's absolutely the case. And so you've all, I'm sure, had this experience when you've been on a long vacation, and after enough time, you're kind of like, I'm tired, I want to go home.
Right.
You've satiated to that experience. And so whatever benefit that break from your normal life could exert, right? Because you've left your normal life. You've taken a vacation. You're going to reset, hopefully, with whatever boredom you had back home. But that effect's already taken place. That happened day one.
Okay.
And so now whatever utility you're getting from the vacation.
So just the act of going on vacation.
Oh yeah.
Even
it's very quick, so it can be very, very quick. Because it's a big change, right? It's not some little thing. I mean, you're leaving your home, you're leaving your environment. It's a fairly sizable. Yes?
So as a company, you're better off limit the accessibility to the certain product and create the lab for the people you benefit more.
Yeah. So there's a very straightforward prediction for your company, which is that if you have limited access, and if you have only seasonal access, and for the life of me, the name is escaping me, but there's a cookie that's only available part of the year. Somebody help me out. Now, well, Girl Scouts too, there's another one, like a chocolate cookie, there's actually like it doesn't matter, but there's actually like a production reason why it can't be around because of the climate. So if it's too warm or too cold, it doesn't work, so there's only like the right time of year. And so one of the reasons people attribute success to this cookie, despite my inability to remember its name, is because it can only be used as
McDonald's does with McRib. It's only out in the fall.
I'm not a huge McDonald's eater, so. But there's a lot of reasons for that. So scarcity in and of itself is going to have a positive impact, but to the extent that it's reducing your satiation because time's passing, yeah. Okay, yes.
Have you looked at any of the effects of like a super category good? So for instance, having a chocolate Godiva truffle and then an M&M, and when you have something that's so much higher, none of what you're saying, and thinking about all of the other M&Ms and other experiences you've had, you really just want the super luxury good. It kind of crushes that.
Yeah, and that's the hedonic treadmill in essence, right? Okay. So once you've had Godiva or whatever is even better than that, the lower stuff doesn't give you the same level of utility. But the reason you started with the Godiva is because you probably were a little tired of M&Ms. Right? There's one of them. There could be external reasons somebody just gave it to you, but if you made this decision yourself, that could be one. So yeah, once you go super premium, right, it's kind of hard to go back down. Okay. Let's do one more question, maybe. Or?
Oh no, I'm sorry. We've got another event that's starting in just a minute. You can probably have access afterwards, but keep an eye on this one. Jeff Galak is younger than most of our MBA students, and you're going to see a lot of different.
I don't think that's true. Thank you very much.